Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Amy Russo, the author of Women of the White House, the illustrated story of the First Ladies of the United States of America. She's a city reporter at the Providence Journal and has written for Huffington Post, the New York Post, and USA Today. Thanks so much for being here, Ms. Russo.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. When I was growing up, I remember getting a coffee table book that was maybe twice the length and width of a regular hardcover. It had the portraits of, at that time, all 41 presidents, so I was about 10 or so. Each president had a big color portrait on the right side, and on the left side page was a bio sheet full of their essential data, the place of birth, their parents' names, their career path, what offices they held previously, all those things, cause of death, where they died, and then important events that happened during their administration. The book became one of the vehicles that got me into politics and started my lifelong love of history. I love seeing their pictures laid out in order, looking into their faces. Women of the White House by Amy Russo is a similar book, but it's about first ladies. Each first lady's portrait is accompanied by an article that is more than just essential data. They're stories of how each first lady impacted their husband and thus American history. So, Amy, if I may call you Amy, when and how did you decide that we needed to learn about the first ladies in this context, in this format?
Well, the idea started with Welbeck, which is the publisher, and they had reached out and they said they had a concept for a book about first ladies and they were looking for a writer and would I consider it? And I happily accepted, because one thing I learned after doing a little research of my own is that the field of First Lady scholarship is really, really small. There still aren't a lot of truly comprehensive books about the First Ladies, what they did, their political contributions, their lives. I believe the first book that was really in-depth and totally comprehensive was written by Betty Boyd Caroli, and it was released in the 80s, and it's called First Ladies. And there have been many updates since, but anybody looking to get into the field, I mean, that's where I started. I looked through that book, and, it spurred a lot of my other research. But, researching the field, there really still aren't that many books around. So that was a huge propeller for me to keep going with it, because I think it is crucial that we learn more, that we have more knowledge and more history available to people who want to learn about it.
Why do you think an illustrated history was so important? Anybody, I guess, maybe not anyone could write the articles, but, it wouldn't take a lot of creativity, I guess, or maybe provoke the same type of thought in your readers if there weren't the illustrated aspect of this book. Why do you think that was so important?
Yeah, I think that adds a lot to the book rather than just, reading the text, because part of what you see are not just the portraits of the different women, but also sometimes you'll see artifacts from their lives. I believe there's a lock of hair, perhaps from Martha Jefferson, I think it was, because after her passing, Thomas Jefferson was so deep in mourning that he actually carried around that with him in remembrance of her. It was an incredible story, the way the two of them were connected even after her death. So, and there are other things aside from that, other objects that belong to them that have been photographed and placed in the book. So you get a sense, as if walking through a museum, of what their lives were like. And I think the portraits are also very telling. Of course, earlier on in the First Ladyship, we didn't necessarily have lots of portraits of each First Lady. So I find the ones that we have to be kind of interesting. I always wonder, a lot of them are done in a way that makes the First Lady look very young, even though some of them were advanced in age when they entered office. So I always wonder, what would they have looked like? What would they have, been like? But I think the visual element, it really helps to fill in some of those gaps. And indeed, there are a lot of gaps still because, only parts of history have been recorded. And I think our research there's a limit, I guess, to how much we can truly know, but I think it helps.
What is amazing is that I'm somebody who can recognize every president, and I know tons about them. I've spent my entire life reading about each one and keeping track of what I've read about each one. And you recognize, or at least I recognize all of them by face right away. Very few of the first ladies going back, certainly into the 1800s and into the, even if you look at some of the early first 4 or 5 of them, placing a name with a face is more difficult with the first ladies. I know what I think, at least, to the answer to this question, but what do you think about what that says, as you called it, about the field of scholarship when it comes to the first ladies, that even someone like myself didn't recognize all of them right away?
Yeah, I think the answer is that it says that we as Americans aren't very familiar with the history of the first ladyship and the people that held that position. Of course, we always look to the president as the center of power, and in many cases, in all cases, he is. But the woman, his right-hand woman, you could say, in many cases was an influential person. Not in all cases. There were a handful of situations in which first ladies were reticent, where they just didn't want the job. And of course, it had been kind of, circumstances had thrust that position upon them. So, rightfully so, I guess some of them it wasn't in their life plan. But, there were still very many impactful women. And I think, Americans, I don't get the sense that we're always very aware of our history in general. I think, internationally speaking, we'd probably rank a little lower in terms of familiarity with history. But I think especially when it comes to the First Lady, there really is a lack of awareness.
You say the role of First Lady is defined by culture as opposed to the Constitution. Let's start, I guess, with the title of First Lady. Where did it come from and what did it mean?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure when exactly that became kind of the commonly used title, but you're right that it was not written into any of our governmental documents. It still isn't. There's no official job description that exists. There's no pay that's associated with the role. And so the way I look at kind of how it came to be more defined, I think it's more in these incremental steps that it occurred. Edith Roosevelt had set the precedent of having paid staff. Rosalind Carter was the first lady to establish her own East Wing working space. So I think, those things plus the use of the title, you start to see over the course of decades, really, the slow, creation of that role and sort of making it more official, even though it's not official. It's really just ceremonial. So I think that helps to give it some more, I guess, more of a credence, I guess. But yeah, a lot of it is defined by culture, defined by what our expectations are of first ladies, and also the precedents that were set by the first ones we served.
And today we're used to first ladies having causes, as you mentioned. Jill Biden is the teacher in chief. Melania Trump advocated for an end to bullying. Michelle Obama encouraged healthy eating. Laura Bush promoted literacy. Does that make it an office or is it a role?
I guess you could say technically it's an office to the extent that there now is the East Wing and the First Lady now has her own office, which obviously wasn't always the case. But I'd say overall it's more of a role because it's, there aren't really defined expectations. There are societal expectations based on what people have done in the past and what people are expected to do in the future. But it really is open to definition, which is why it's also so interesting, is that, unlike the role of, the president or any other elected official, you don't have this specific set of duties. You have kind of the freedom to champion, different causes or do different things. And I guess a lot of elected officials have that power in their own right. But I think with the first ladyship, it's more malleable.
What's interesting is that there have been several reluctant first ladies in recent history. Melania Trump, Michelle Obama, she famously was not thrilled with her husband's foray into politics, and then it became much more than a foray. Um, there are also some relatively eager ones, despite the difficulties that they experienced. Hillary Clinton, Nancy Reagan. The first one was also reluctant. Martha Washington. How did she shape the role the way George Washington shaped the presidency?
Yeah, I love that fun fact that Martha Washington was reluctant, because I think if you don't know a lot about the history of the first ladyship, you might assume that maybe she was really enthused about the role. But she, even Abigail Adams after her, neither one of them was thrilled about it. But Martha Washington, I think, because she was kind of unsure of what exactly the role should entail and how exactly she should shape it, I think what she ended up doing was more of restricting herself to traditional duties. You know, she hosted formal dinners and public receptions, both of which became, I believe, weekly events. So she established some kind of structure there where there was an expectation that, okay, once a week there's going to be a dinner, once a week there's going to be, you know, a time when we welcome the community into the White House. So I think she really set the table for it being a hostessing role primarily in its early days, which I think to this day is still, you know, an expectation, but I think that was much weightier expectation earlier on.
Maybe the most famous first lady moment of all time, and that's if you consider the good moments. I mean, you know, obviously some of the bad ones have really been captured by history and described over and over again, but it's when Dolly Madison saw the British were coming during the War of 1812, and maybe some of this has become a myth, but for the most part it seems like this happened. She grabbed the portrait of George Washington off the wall and took it for safekeeping. And I love when George W. Bush looked at Michelle Obama and said, if there's anything happens, there's your man. In other words, pull that one down and take it with you. What does the moment of Dolly Madison taking that portrait off the wall say about the perspective of history that first ladies have and how they are in some ways guards of the White House mansion?
Yeah, that was such a memorable moment, historically speaking, and such a key moment that really defined who she became remembered as. I should note there are historians who believe it's more likely that she may have directed a slave to grab the portrait and take it down. So, you know, who knows what actually happened inside that room, but you know, you could say it was definitely her idea, her intent to make sure that it's safeguarded, whether or not she took it or somebody else took it. But I think it says that there was this, you know, deep pride in the culture around the White House, deep pride in history, and a, you know, a strong patriotism and a desire to safeguard, you know, our historical artifacts, really. So even in that harrowing moment when they were going through a total crisis, she had the presence of mind to think of this. So I think it is quite remarkable.
How do they start to gather political influence? How does the office, I should say, start to gather political influence? You described the teas that were organized by Louisa Adams. How important was that? And explain what those teas were.
Yeah, so Dolly Madison, she had organized weekly squeezes, and she was our fourth first lady?
Fourth
Yes,
first
fourth.
lady, yeah.
So she'd organized weekly squeezes, and they were called that because of the number of people that would squeeze into the White House, and they were politicians from both sides of the aisle. And the point of this was it was a social event, but it was kind of thinly veiled because it was also a way to hobnob with other politicians, have conversations, meet with different people. And so that was kind of something that made her influential, because even though she was playing the hostessing role, this was a clever event. Lots of political opportunities for people existed within the weekly squeezes that were held. And at one point, there's even some, I guess, folklore, which I assume is true, that she dipped snuff with Henry Clay, who was the war hawk Speaker of the House, because her husband couldn't really be seen allying himself with Henry Clay. It just wouldn't have been acceptable then. So she was kind of the go-between in that way. So she was, politically influential to some degree, I guess. And then as you go through history, obviously, women feel more empowered to take on that role at certain points. And of course, you remember Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton and classic examples like that. But there were also, the Dolly Madisons who made perhaps smaller, less obvious contributions that were still powerful in their own right.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
The term you use there is dipping snuff. That is chewing tobacco, correct?
I believe it is, though I really should look it up.
All right, we're going to Google it real quick. Dipping snuff, right? Okay. Right. But my years as a high school and Federation baseball player, I believe I remember the word snuff from the other players' lexicons. Not something I ever partook in, but dipping snuff. Another first lady that I think is fascinating and one that has gotten some attention from one very famous scholar over the last few years is Amy Greenberg. She wrote a book on Sarah Polk. And you describe Sarah Polk's quote as Mrs. Polk believes. She didn't want to quite speak for her husband, but she was sort of also speaking for herself. Explain how Mrs. Polk believes became part of, if not our national lexicon, at least her lexicon.
Yeah, so Sarah Polk, while she's definitely not the most likable first lady, she definitely was politically clever. And it's funny because she opposed suffrage, she opposed the abolition of slavery, and yet she herself wanted power. So while she didn't want, other women to have power, she didn't want slaves to have power, she wanted that power for herself. So, and she knew too that she operated in what was then and still very much is a man's world. And so while speaking with other politicians or influential people, she would frame her own opinions, it's said by historians, kind of through the lens of her husband. She would say, oh, well, Mr. Polk thinks this, Mr. Polk thinks that. And really it would be her own opinions. So it was kind of this veiled way of sharing what she thought without looking like, a woman who was trying to inappropriately have too much say.
And it's interesting because her husband, James Polk, had such an influence and such an impact on the United States' future. And here she is having her own impact on the future of first ladies. I want to take a brief aside here because it is not written anywhere, essentially, as to what the office of first lady should or shouldn't be. And it doesn't even have to be the president's wife. And around that time of history, we have a number of first ladies who were not the president's wife. We, over the last 100 years or so, have had essentially since Edith Wilson, and I guess even before that, the first lady has always been the wife. Explain some of the first ladies who we had who were not married to the president.
Yeah, so there were those who died before office. So Martha Jefferson passed away before office. Her daughter Patsy sometimes filled in. Rachel Jackson died before her husband took office. Hannah Van Buren, there's very little known about her, but she also died before her husband took office. So what would happen in these situations is usually if the what would have been the first lady had a daughter by then, the daughter could fill in, or perhaps a niece could fill in, but they wouldn't be expected to fill in on a constant basis to the same extent that the actual first lady would have done. I don't think there was any point in history where all those expectations were kind of put on their shoulders. But if there was a significant social gathering, something where there needed to be some organizational help, then, they would step in as hostess and they'd contribute. But again, not on a very full-time basis.
Let's talk about Mary Todd Lincoln. She probably, certainly, other than Hillary Clinton, probably has had the most ink spilled about her in terms of trying to figure out what she meant to her husband and what influence she had politically and what happened after her husband served as president. She led a fascinating life in those years following her husband's death. Describe what you think is Mary Todd's influence on the first ladyship, and how do we see her influence today?
Well, I think the one thing that people remember, unfortunately, about Mary Todd Lincoln is her erratic behavior. And to that extent, I think her influence on the first ladyship was, I don't know that she had huge influence on it, but she definitely left a mark in perhaps a more negative way because of her behavior. It was suspected that she was probably dealing with some sort of mental illness, possibly bipolar. It seemed to have worsened over time. And of course, the traumatic events that she suffered in her life, might have only accelerated that, might have only intensified it. Not only losing her husband to an assassin, but also losing 2 of her children. And so she really was a woman that had suffered great tragedy. And there was a fair amount of criticism over her. I think, the press might have looked at her more as a thing of amusement because of the way she was. But I think she had definitely seen a lot of hardship.
Let's talk about some of your favorites. One of my favorite presidents, and this is almost not repeated by almost anybody else, but I love Taft. I just love the guy. His time in office has been sort of swallowed up by the fact that he's bookended by Teddy Roosevelt on one side and then Woodrow Wilson in World War I on the other side. But Taft, I find, is just a fascinating guy. And you talk a lot about Helen Taft and how important she was, particularly in how she pushed for the education of women. Talk about Helen Taft, and then give us some of your other favorites.
Yeah, Helen Taft is a really interesting woman because she's one of those people that is kind of credited with, being the reason that her husband ever ran for president. So when we think about the influence of the first lady, just the fact that, obviously whoever you're married to is probably going to be pretty impactful on your life. She was somebody who, ever before he entered politics, she was steering him in that direction. Early on, she helped to connect him with the right people at an early age. I believe it was a kind of an intellectual discussion group that she was part of that she invited him into, and he met other like-minded people there. And so she was kind of, shaping him, molding him to be this type of person that could maybe one day be a leader. So I think that's pretty fascinating. She's the woman behind the man, I think.
We have to talk about Edith Wilson. I mean, because of what happened to her husband, he had a stroke while he was traveling, and suddenly she is essentially the gatekeeper to the office of the presidency.
Yeah, she's another fascinating example, somebody who was most vital during the time her husband was president, because obviously after he was incapacitated by a pretty severe stroke, she ended up taking the reins. And, at that time there was pressure for him to basically give up the job because, physically speaking, I think it's fair to say he couldn't really do it anymore. His health had become that poor. So in her memoirs, and there are some historians that think she might have overstated her role, but in her memoirs she writes that she had kind of liaised with different politicians and different folks to transmit or keep information from the president while he was sick. So she had really become, in some ways, the person who was steering the ship. And I think there was some upsetment over that, some feelings that it was very inappropriate what had happened and the way that power was being kind of shifted to her side. But she definitely was somebody that the president relied on a great deal when he was ill.
I'm not passing judgment on this statement, but there are some people who consider it one of the biggest scandals in American history that we essentially had an unelected president. It's hard for me to judge that. We've had a lot of scandals.
Yeah.
Eleanor Roosevelt, obviously, she's one of the most storied first ladies. She helped set up the United Nations. And there's a push to put her present day on, I guess it's the $10 bill or the $20 bill, probably the 10. Either way, Eleanor Roosevelt, what impact did she have, and how did she start to make the first ladyship even bigger than it already was?
So she had a huge impact both during the time of her husband's tenure and even after. She was very public service minded, devoted to the World War I effort. She was also a master of media. It's crazy how much involvement she had with media and what great command she had of it. Not only did she write books, she delivered radio broadcasts on a somewhat regular basis. She penned a nationally syndicated newspaper column, which I don't think any first lady has ever done to this day except for her. And she shared that power with women as well. She had even, of course, this would be so controversial today, and I'm sure it was then, but she had even blocked men out of press conferences so that women could have more of a voice. And she was very, I think, social justice minded as well. One story I love is that, at a point, each first lady would get kind of honorary membership in the DAR, this group called the Daughters of the American Revolution, which, for those who don't know, is a collection of women who are tasked with, proving that their lineage goes back to revolutionary times, and then they can become part of what is, in many ways, a social club. And so first ladies would serve as kind of their honorary president during their tenure. And there was, an undercurrent of racism there because the DAR would not allow a Black singer, Marian Anderson, to perform in its concert hall. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, she resigned from the DAR in protest, and it became a very public show that she would not tolerate discrimination of that kind. And so even after her tenure, she was still influential. In 1962, JFK appointed her to his Commission on the Status of Women that looked at workplace and educational inequality. So she still, I think it was Truman who called her First Lady of the World at some point. So she really had an outsized influence.
And she is maybe responsible for the most poignant quote, perhaps, in the history of the First Ladyship. She said, I think it was Harry Truman. Well, I know it was Harry Truman who said, "Is there anything we can do for you, Mrs. Roosevelt?" And she said, "No, what can we do for you? You're the one in trouble now." Great quote. You mentioned Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy did a commercial in Spanish that may have helped her husband win the presidency. What a moment that is for the First Ladyship, stepping out. I guess this was before she became First Lady, but it made clear that she was going to be a prominent, if not necessarily member of the administration, she was going to be a major part of the public face of the administration.
Yeah, Jackie Kennedy, she spoke several different languages, I believe French, Spanish, possibly something else. So she was pretty cultured, and she also presented really well to media. She was always put together. I think she could be politically influential in terms of helping her husband. You mentioned the commercial in Spanish, which was definitely, she definitely proved herself to be an asset in that regard. And I think one thing that always impresses me is also her stoicism when she suffered from the assassination of her husband, and the photo of her, that really famous photo of her standing on Air Force One when the new president was being sworn in, and she was still wearing the same bloodstained, clothing from that moment. So, and she's a very, poker face in that photo. So I think there's a lot to be said for her strength, for her ability to be an asset in in what she did for her husband as well during his life.
The movie Jackie that came out, I don't know, maybe it's probably 3-4 years ago now. Really worth seeing. I would highly recommend. I'm sure you've seen it, but the movie Jackie was really, really good. I got a cheat sheet from your publishing staff, and you wrote, or someone wrote on the cheat sheet that your favorite First Lady is Betty Ford. Tell us
She
why.
is, yes. Yeah, so Betty Ford, I just found to be very refreshing in my research. And of course, she was around before my time. But one of the things I love about her is that it appears that every time she suffered from some kind of personal struggle, she made it something that would be a public service to others. So shortly after she entered the White House, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And back then, talking about a diagnosis like that would be kind of taboo. People didn't really discuss breast cancer publicly, but she ended up putting out a public call to all women to immediately go to screening centers and just get checked. And that included the second lady at that time, the wife of the vice president, who found out that she too had breast cancer. She had a double mastectomy. So, you know, you could say that the first lady at that time had actually kind of, in a way, helped to save the second lady's life by making this not something that was shrouded in secrecy, not something that was shameful, and really attempting to help others through her diagnosis. And she did the same thing when she was suffering from addiction, which hadn't really been made very public, at least by Betty Ford, until after she had left the White House. And then, of course, she sets up the Betty Ford Clinic, which is just admitted so many people, both, you know, famous and average people, and has really done a lot of good.
And isn't it amazing that talk of addiction is thankfully so prominent today, and is such a part of our discourse that we don't even give it a second thought that she is the one who blazed that trail.
Yeah, she really was. And I would assume that at that time, when she was suffering from it, and perhaps it might have been somewhat publicly known before she left the White House, but maybe not very much, that, you know, then it probably still would have been controversial. But I think today she's really remembered as somebody who really did a great service for others who were facing the same problem.
Hillary Clinton, of course, said being first lady during her presidential run in 2016, and I'm sure in 2008 too, although I remember 2016 a little better. That's only 4 years ago as opposed to 12 years ago. She said being first lady was great preparation for being president. How did she transform the political power of the first ladyship by essentially basing a run for the presidency not just on being Secretary of State, not just on being a senator from New York, but on being the first lady?
Yeah, I think she was somebody that I didn't know this, but from the outset of her life was a political person, even dating back to her college graduation when she spoke at commencement, and she dressed down an elected official who was there and had spoken. She had felt that what he said was a defense of the Nixon administration at that time, and she stood up to that person. So, yeah, Hillary Clinton has always been influential. I would say that the greatest service she did for the first ladyship in some ways is managing to become an elected official herself while serving as first lady, which was unprecedented then, and still remains something that has not been replicated. And I think in her own way, by doing that, she broadened the role. And that, I think, was something that was pretty unexpected. I don't know if everybody would have thought it would be appropriate for a first lady to also be a senator. But now there's a precedent. So now there's that kind of open door for first ladies who want to have more influence than just this ceremonial position to pursue greater ambitions if that's where they feel like their future lies.
And we also have to talk about Jill Biden, one of her successors. She is the only first lady to, as far as we know, to make a salary in the first ladyship. Of course, is not paid. It's not prescribed in the Constitution, but she's making a salary now as a teacher. What does that say about how this office is transforming and maybe transforming even further into the future?
Yeah, so Jill Biden, she has, right out from the gate made a huge contribution to the first ladyship by still working as a teacher while being first lady, which is unprecedented. I think, there's this expectation that you set aside whatever your career may be at that moment in service of the White House and the first ladyship. And in addition to that, she also is perhaps the most highly educated first lady we've ever had. She has a PhD and 2 masters. But also Michelle Obama has a law degree, as did Hillary Clinton. So I guess it depends how you evaluate different degrees. But needless to say, she is very educated. And I think, her setting that precedent of being a working first lady kind of paves a pathway for others to do the same if they wish.
Should first ladies be paid by the taxpayer, given how much their role has expanded?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and one I've never been asked before. I kind of feel like they should be, because of the amount of, the number of duties they have, the expectations of the role, though I really think it varies. I think that's where the question is difficult, is that it varies from first lady to first lady, how active they are. And we've had some first ladies, decades and decades ago, who frankly didn't do much at all out of choice. And we've had other first ladies who've done, a huge amount. So I guess it kind of depends. If you ask me about a specific first lady, should they have been paid? I think I could say yes or no. But
Right.
I guess it depends on the person. So it's a tough question, but it's definitely an interesting one.
Which first ladies captured their time perfectly? In other words, represented their time perfectly in terms of the role that women were expected to play in society, and then which ones extended themselves beyond that role?
Well, I'd have to say the ones that go above and beyond are definitely Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton. But also, to give you a couple other recent examples, both Rosalind Carter and Nancy Reagan were also both politically influential. They kind of, I think, in many ways extended themselves beyond what was expected of the role. Nancy Reagan, I like the story about her kind of reaction to the whole Iran-Contra affair, that it's said that she engineered the firing of the president's chief of staff, Donald Regan, and she had also helped to kind of direct the president's response to media at this time, and how he was going to patch up his image. Rosalind Carter, she kind of played the role of ambassador, which is, something that not a lot of first ladies always do. She traveled to Latin America, traveled to the Caribbean. Jimmy Carter called her a very equal partner. So some other examples of women who've gone above and beyond. As for women who really fit their time, that's an interesting question. I would say, when you get earlier into history, you have more of those traditional hostessing duties, which I think was very, emblematic of the time. I really like Lucy Hayes. Makes me laugh because she, instituted temperance in the White House, which I think perhaps, part of it came from her own background, but I could see that perhaps fitting with her own time. And she was nicknamed Lemonade Lucy. So there were a lot of cultural influences that kind of shaped what the First Lady did that were reflective of their time as well.
Was there another first lady, of course, other than Hillary Clinton, who we have any indication wanted to be president themselves?
That is a great question. I don't know. I wonder if maybe Eleanor Roosevelt could have felt that way, perhaps. It does seem, at least from everything she did, that she enjoyed having a very, public-facing image. She liked being out there. She liked public service. She liked, all of her involvement with media, which she was quite skilled at. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure. That's a great question.
I guess I gave myself kind of a lightning round of questions here to see what you think about some of this stuff. This is another one. Maybe you haven't heard this one. Or maybe you have. Which president would have been the best first gentleman based on what we know?
Oh, wow. I've never been asked that either.
There we go. We got 3 or 4 first timers here.
Yeah,
Who'd have been a
that
good
is
first gentleman?
a tough question. I don't know that I'm sure about that either.
Let me
That's
think.
interesting.
Let me think. JFK would have been an excellent first gentleman. He looks, the suit,
Yeah, I
the
could
suit's
see
well
that.
cut, and he knows when to step forward and when not to. He was pretty good walking around with kings and queens. I could see that. Um, Let me think. How about another one? Teddy Roosevelt would have been an awful first gentleman. He would have
Oh
been
no,
way too
no.
talky, way too
Yeah,
talky.
he needs to have power. He's somebody that needs to carry a big stick.
Right, right. Well, if you think of any others as we continue our conversation, let me know. Presidents who would have
All
been
right.
good first gentlemen. Has American feminism been helped or hurt by the ideal of the first lady?
I suppose it kind of depends on which woman we're talking about, but I certainly think that there is, a general upward trend of women gaining more power in the first ladyship as you move through the history of the role. So I think um, I would guess, to be an optimist, I guess I think American feminism has been helped by the first ladyship, and to have a woman that is. Well, now I don't know. That's another tough question. I guess in some ways, it reinforces this notion that women are expected to be in one role and men are expected to be in the other. The fact that we call it the first ladyship, automatically signifies that it's a female role. And this whole concept of first gentleman is something that our era is still not used to. So I guess when you think about, let me rephrase my answer. When you think about the titles, I think that doesn't help because it
Yeah.
reinforces that notion in our head. But there are certainly, quite a few women who have managed to wield a good bit of power in that role. So when I think about that, I think about, you know, uh, even Frances Cleveland, rather, she was even helpful, like Eleanor Roosevelt, to women in the press. So I think about things like that, like women helping other women, and in some ways that's been kind of sharing the power. But the titles probably don't help.
Here's another, I just thought of it, another president who would have been a good first gentleman, George W. Bush. And that's because he's funny, right?
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Perhaps. George W. Bush, there's another potential first gentleman who would have been good at it. If you could give the first lady one presidential power, in other words, transfer something that is under the president's authority to the first lady, what would it be?
Wow, you're throwing some tough questions at me. Oh God.
I know which one I would do, but you go ahead. Which presidential power should be in the hands of the first lady to make our country better?
Honestly, I think I'd have to say none of them, because the first ladyship is not an elected role. So I almost feel like it
You
would be
got me
kind of
there.
unfair to the voter to
You got me there.
give a power to somebody who's not been elected. So, I mean, is this whole concept of first lady kind of quaint and outdated, and should we just, maybe do away with it? Yeah, perhaps. But, to give it, some sort of a power that we bestow on an elected official, I think perhaps wouldn't be appropriate.
Well, I'm going to give you one that may not be appropriate then. How about the power to make war?
Oh, wow. Okay.
As we're sitting here watching another American adventure overseas go up in flames.
Yeah, perhaps we'd have less war. I don't know. Who knows? That's a
It'd be
good
tough to have
question.
more of it. uh, give us some book recommendations. Best biographies of first ladies.
Yeah, I would definitely have to go with Betty Boyd Caroli's First Ladies. Very simple title, easy to remember. It is, in my opinion, the most comprehensive work that I have read out of anything that I've come across. So that is my top recommendation.
Best first lady to teach about to fourth graders.
Ooh, I think Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm very biased. I mean, I think she's just a great example of what a first lady can do. And I feel like she did the most. And there's just, there's so many accomplishments and so many great stories that go back to her tenure.
One of the concepts that your book wrestles with is this idea that that the first ladies have been very close to power, but not quite there. Is there someone in the political arena right now who's a female, let's go with female, who has the best chance to be president, that you're watching closely and saying maybe this person could be president someday?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd have to say, and maybe this is kind of an obvious answer, I'm not sure, but Vice President Kamala Harris, I think, she, even
She's
while
close
she was
enough
running
at this point, right? Yeah.
She is pretty close, and while she was a candidate, obviously, like so many of the female candidates we had, she had a pretty big resume, a pretty accomplished resume, and I think, I think in some ways the bar is a little higher for women. If you look at like her background, Elizabeth Warren's background, there's so many, such a rich list of accomplishments. And obviously she's made it to the vice presidency, as did Biden before he became president. So I think there's a chance.
I'm going to put you on the spot even more than I already have. Was this a precursor for another book project?
Yeah, I would love to write another book, and I would say that I'm almost certainly going to. I don't think it would be about first ladies, but I see it more as being something that, because I'm a reporter, I think it would probably come out of like a story that I'll work on at some point one day that perhaps lends itself to a book or something investigative or something that there's a lot of meat to. So I'm always kind of keeping my eyes open for what could that thing be, because I enjoyed this process. I love the research, and I think I think everybody's got at least one book in them. So hopefully
I'll take you up on that. How about that? Right? Everyone's got one book in them, in their head somewhere.
I think so.
It'd be interesting to have a book on I'm not saying you should do this, but it'd be interesting to have a book on presidential children, wouldn't it? To see all the children laid out in this format.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before. Yeah,
interesting, right?
Very interesting.
You mentioned you're a reporter. Tell us about the work that you're doing. I'm a local news reporter, and I understand you're a local news reporter. I work in Tampa, covering news of all kinds in Tampa, and you work in Providence, right? Tell us about your day-to-day life as a reporter and what kinds of things you're covering up there.
I love it. I think it might have been H.L. Mencken who said that reporting is the life of kings, and I have to agree.
I agree.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful way to get paid. So here in Providence, I'm the city reporter for the Providence Journal. So on a day-to-day basis right now, that means a lot of crime, but we're in the summer months, it tends to, as it is nationally, frankly. So it's that. Policing is another thing I report on, the mayor's office, whatever's going on there, any announcements, any, we have a mayor who may run for governor, very likely to run for governor. So we've got, our mayoral races coming up, our gubernatorial races coming up. And sometimes I cover the State House. And then sometimes it could be something completely random that I am just interested in, and I kind of run with it. So we've had a lot of post-pandemic I say post-pandemic, but here we are kind of still in the pandemic very much so. So maybe one day. But kind of pandemic recovery stories about local businesses or other aspects of life in the city. So it's a really broad beat, which I love.
Yeah, what you're describing is something that is one of my favorite sayings that I've ever heard in journalism. I guess it was 2004. I was an intern at KNBC in Los Angeles, and a brilliant executive producer there named Wendy Harris, who I'm still Facebook friends with, said to me, reporting is a front row seat at life. And I never forgot that. And that's the life you're living now.
Yeah, that is the perfect way to describe it. And that is exactly why I got into it, because reporting just allows you to go places, meet people, learn things, do things. I mean, you just experiencing life. So I love it.
It's awesome. And I agree with you. Amy Russo, author of Women of the White House, the illustrated story of the First Ladies of the United States of America. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly check out that book, also the Providence Journal, and her Twitter profile at Amy M. Russo. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.